Hello, members of Cook County College Teachers Union. This is Legislative Chair Troy Swanson, and this video is about the underfunding of community colleges in Illinois. So I'm going to take a guess that most of you watching this video are not quite as nerdy as I am when it comes to studying how community colleges are funded. Thus, I want to start with the key takeaways of this video right off the bat, just in case you bail out before we get to the end. Okay, here they are. The historic model of how we fund community colleges does not work when the state of Illinois does not uphold its obligation. And frankly, for the last 2 decades, the state has fallen quite short. Over the last 2 decades, the state support has dropped by 23% to community colleges. To fully fund Illinois' community colleges, the state of Illinois would need to contribute an additional $700 million to its annual budget. And we're seeing the impact. What is the impact? The impact is tuition keeps going up, and there's pressure on services that we provide. Services are being reduced. Now, I hope you stick with it on this video a little bit, because I'm going to dig into some of the details, and I think you will understand all of this a lot better. But just in case, these are the 4 main ideas of this video. Okay, so let's start with the basics. This is sort of like community college funding 101. Illinois' approach to funding community colleges is supposed to be a balanced approach. So this is the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 model. So 1/3 of our budgets come from property taxes, 1/3 from the state of Illinois, and 1/3 from tuition. Ideally, none of these as individual funding lines need to be overly high because the other two help balance it out. So our property taxes can be kept down because we have contributions from the state and from tuition. The state of Illinois shouldn't have to contribute as much money as it might to the university system because we are getting property taxes and we're getting tuition. And of course, the real goal, right, is that our tuition remains affordable because it can be offset by property taxes and support from the state of Illinois, thus the balanced approach. So I'd like to just take a moment and look at how the state of Illinois distributes monies to the community colleges across the state. The first way, and this is the biggest portion of the money that each college will receive, is in base operating grants. These can really be used for anything, just to operate the college. It's based on a credit hour basis, so that's how the state accounts for the different sizes of colleges. So if you give out more credits, you get a little more money. If you're a smaller college, you get a little less, so that it kind of balances out. The state looks at the actual costs, and this is through ICCB, looks at the expenditures, and then there's a formula that breaks it down, and there's an estimate for what each credit hour is worth. And then they take that estimate and they break it down into 6 different categories. And that's the baccalaureate, business, technical, health, developmental education, and adult education. And each of those 6 are reimbursed at a slightly different rate to try to compensate for the differences in those programs. So that's the core of our state money that we get, is in the base operating grants. The second major revenue source from the state comes in equalization grants. And this is intended to offset some of the differences we see in property taxes across all the different community colleges in Illinois. It's not a shock, right, to know that property taxes are in an inequitable way to fund education. So some districts will have really high property taxes, some will have really low property taxes. And so what the state does is it sets kind of like a benchmark, like a threshold based on the per student average of property taxes. And the colleges that fall under this threshold get these additional equalization grants. So the whole goal with equalization is to smooth out some of these differences in budgets that we will see naturally arise because of the differences in property taxes. So if we go back, the base operating grant, that was the first grant that I talked about, everybody receives a same base operating grant based on credit hours. Equalization, on the other hand, not every college gets equalization. So the colleges that have higher property values may not receive equalization. Also, not every college gets equalization every single year. So some years you may get equalization to help offset. So maybe there's been property tax changes, maybe property taxes in other districts has gone up so that the average has changed so that your college is below. So this is a grant that some colleges get regularly, other colleges get once in a while, and some colleges rarely ever get. 90% of the funding that comes from the state of Illinois to community colleges comes from the base operating grants and the equalization grants. About 10% comes from a handful of other kinds of grants. Sometimes these are special initiatives. Some of these are federal money that flows through the state. There's a whole bunch of them, and it's not really worth the time to break all of these down, but I do want to acknowledge that there are other sources that are out there that do have impact on special programs. They make up about, a small percentage, about 10% or so. So here's the quick summary of our funding basics. Illinois, in theory, uses a balanced approach. A third of our funding from property taxes, a third from the state, a third from tuition. All colleges get a base operating grant that's based on credit hours. Some colleges get the equalization offset, which helps smooth out differences in property taxes. And there's some other stuff that we get, but it's too small to talk about in this video. All right, so that was the basics on how things should work. Let's talk about the cold, dark reality of how they're actually working. So before we dive into the details of how community colleges are funded, let's take a step back and talk about Illinois higher ed overall. So this would include community colleges, but it also includes the university systems, U of I, Eastern, Western, Northern, Chicago State, Governor State, etc. No surprise, we are underfunded. So if you look at the year 2000 and what Illinois spent on higher ed, it was about $2.15 billion. If you adjust that for inflation to today's numbers, that would be about $4.5 billion. In the most recent budget that was passed, they supported higher ed at $2.6 billion. So that is about $2 billion under, technically $1.87 billion under where we were in adjusted dollars from the year 2000. If they were just going to keep even with where we were in the year 2000, they would need to add about $2 billion. Another way to think about it is overall for higher ed, in the year 2003, the state covered 74% of all of the costs to go to college. As of 2022, the state covers about 35%. So students are having to pick up the rest. So there's a gap there of about $1 to $1.5 billion from what overall higher ed needs and what the state of Illinois pays. So community colleges are a part of this. We are not alone. It's the same issues that we face that are also faced by our university partners. The reality that we face for community colleges is that the funding formula of one-third, one-third, one-third really is a myth. And actually, it has been for a long time. If we go back to the year 2002, about 25% of our college budgets were covered by the state of Illinois. So it was well under, even over 20 years ago, it was well under the one-third idea that we had in our formula. But today, it is even less. And the most recent numbers we have is that in 2019, this was about 14%. By 2024, this is even lower. Just to give you some ideas on like actual money, if we look at 2004, the state budgeted about $469 million for community colleges. If we adjust for inflation, the money that they budget today is $361 million. So that is less. So we have lost money in our budgets from the state of Illinois. That's about a 23% decrease in funding over 2 decades. So the state of Illinois is shrinking, and really, in so many ways, it is putting strains on our budgets and strains on the success that we can have in terms of services, in terms of what our students have to pay. If we look at ICCB data for what it actually costs to produce a credit hour in our colleges across Illinois, and the state of Illinois held up its one-third obligation, the state of Illinois should be paying around $637 million more in base operating grants and over $92 million more in equalization grants. When the state falls short, the funding formulas are adjusted in 2 ways. So first, the base operating budgets are prorated. So whatever percentage the state falls short, that percentage is knocked off of the credit hour reimbursement we get from the state of Illinois. And then second, the equalization grants are either entirely eliminated or greatly reduced. So some colleges that should get equalization don't get anything. Some colleges that should get more get a percentage less. And so think about this, because the thing with equalization is it's like in our funding model, we have built in a degree of equity. Equalization helps to balance out the differences in property taxes. So the schools that would qualify for equalization are the ones with the lower property taxes that really need that help to offset what they're not getting from the local municipalities. So this really is a failure in the funding formula. When the state doesn't live up to its end, it causes this kind of disparate impact to the different districts within our community colleges. Speaking of impacts, let's take a look at the impact of this underfunding. First, and not surprisingly, tuition is greatly impacted. Since tuition is the only revenue stream that we really control, when state money goes down, our colleges have to push up tuition. So you can see just some quick numbers. In 2004, tuition was around $2,600 for a full load. By 2020, we are now up to over $4,000. It's roughly across the state, increase of about $1,700. And if we look at fees, about $270 increase in fees. And so obviously when we increase tuition, that means there's some students that can no longer afford us, and students aren't able to come to our colleges. Along with this, when tuition is the number one revenue stream in your budget, and for almost all of our community colleges, it is. Most colleges, tuition makes up about 60%. So not the 30%, but it's making up the difference of what the state of Illinois isn't paying. It goes into tuition. So that means when enrollments drop, a big chunk of our budgets drop. And we've seen this since the pandemic as enrollments have gone down. We've really felt disproportionately the impact of that tuition loss, and that impacts the services we can offer, maintenance on buildings, all of those kind of functions that don't really change all that much with the numbers of students. Well, the budgets fall away and they're not able to be supported. Another impact of this underfunding is that our colleges are really declining with inflation. So over these decades, inflation keeps going up, but the state budget doesn't keep up, and it's like an erosion that's happening. And if we just look at a couple recent years that were actually some of the best community college budgets we've seen for a long time, we can see like why this happens or the impact of how this happens. So if we look at FY24, so 2 years ago, the budget actually went up by 7%, which is literally the best budget we have seen in maybe 15 years, probably like 20 years. But inflation was coming off of the 8 to 9% range after the pandemic. So that budget, which was a great budget, was still losing to inflation. So that means tuition will get pushed up. The next year, FY25, which is the year that we're in now, the budget was up 2%, which again was still a generally good budget in the scheme of budgets that we've seen out of the General Assembly. But inflation was 4.5%, 4 to 5%, somewhere in there. So that means it's still losing at least 2% to inflation. So again, that's a good budget that still puts pressure on tuition. So these years they're behind on inflation, and so the impact is we have to keep even somewhere, and it ends up coming out in tuition. So I've mentioned this a few times over the course of this video, but another major impact, right, is that the services we provide get reduced. Many of the offices across our campuses operate with a fraction of the staff for what they really should have to be successful. And we don't like to show this off or talk about this, but if you look around, all of us know that this is true in so many ways. Our administrators are often left with some very difficult choices when the budgets aren't there. And if we hit a rate where we can't raise tuition anymore, well, then services have to be cut. One of the reliances that we have is on part-time faculty, and we have great adjunct faculty, and they do really good work. And there's some people who do not want to be full-time faculty, and they're happy to teach part-time. But I think we all know that there's a lot of adjunct faculty members who would like to be full-time, and that in a lot of departments, a majority of the credits that are given by adjunct faculty, and they're not as connected to the campus. They're not earning the wages that they should earn, and so that becomes a big problem. Along with that, services such as counselors, our libraries, our advisors, our disability services, and so many other services operate at a fraction of the staffing and a fraction of the budgets for what they really should have. I've mentioned this also. There's buildings that need to be updated, new buildings that need to be built, need to be responsive to the changes in the workforce, the change of different professions. And so often our facilities aren't quite where they should be because we don't have the money to put into them. And look, all of us that have been union members for a while know this, but the underfunding really impacts how successful our negotiations can be. When our budgets don't keep up, it makes it difficult to keep our raises up with inflation, or ideally even to beat inflation when we can. It puts a lot of pressure on healthcare and benefits because these are such costly items in our college budgets. And other issues such as class sizes or staffing levels are really, really impacted. So what can we do? So this is the part of the video where I ask you to be involved. We have spent 2 decades building up this funding gap in Illinois, and so it is not going to be fixed in just a few years. That is why I wanted to do this video and to draw your attention to how our funding works, because this is going to take a long-term push and continued pressure by us and our partners to get this fixed. It is so important for us that our union members are voters and that we're supporting our partners who are there fighting for us in Springfield. So at each election, keep an eye out for our endorsed candidates and make sure you're giving them your vote. Currently, the Illinois Community College Board is working on a series of funding recommendations that it will give to the General Assembly. And that's sort of why I'm doing this video now, because when this report comes out, we are going to need to take action to point out the discrepancies and to point out the impact of underfunding. So we're going to be asking you to contact your legislators, to contact your state rep and your state senator, ideally to go to their office when they're in town in their offices, or at least to give them a call, because that has the biggest impact. Also, we're going to be organizing a lobby day where we go down to Springfield and we knock on doors and we try to be vocal and be heard and to make our arguments to the legislators while they're in Springfield. Finally, I have to mention COPE. COPE is our political fund that is a voluntary contribution. As a reminder, we do not use union dues for political work. Everything comes from COPE. So if you're not part of COPE, we really need you. We need all of our members to be part of this. COPE helps pay for things like Lobby Day. It pays for mailings. It helps us pay for phone bankers to make calls to make sure our members are getting out to vote. It is the infrastructure that makes our political activity possible. So to get back to the community college funding issue, I will end this video with the key takeaways that I mentioned at the beginning. First off, the historic model for how we fund community colleges is not working because the state of Illinois is not upholding its obligation. Over the last 2 decades, the state support to community colleges has dropped by 23%. To fully fund community colleges, Illinois would really need to contribute an additional $700 million to its yearly budget. The impact that we are seeing is that tuition is going up, and there are more and more pressures on the services we provide, which are important services to make our students successful. Thank you for sticking with us to the very end. Always feel free to reach out.